To you from Seoul, I'm Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you for joining us. President Moon Jae-in has overhauled his economic team in an attempt to boost South Korea's flagging economy ahead of his third year in office. His chief finance minister and two vice finance ministers have been replaced over the last few days. We'll take a look at what these changes will mean with our guest in the studio a bit later. But first, we catch up with the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin?
Hi, Jung-ho. President Moon has weighed in on the recent court rulings ordering Japanese companies to compensate the Koreans they forced to work for them during World War II. The president says, like in the rulings, that previous agreements between South Korea and Japan do not cancel the rights of individuals to make claims. Shin Se-min reports.
President Moon Jae-in has spoken on the latest friction between Seoul and Tokyo over their fraught history. He met at the Blue House with lawmakers from both countries who are part of the Korea-Japan Parliamentarians Union. He was asked about the forced labor issue and said the victims do have the right to claim compensation from Japanese firms. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled in separate cases late this year that two Japanese firms must compensate Koreans forced to work in their factories when Japan ruled the Korean peninsula as a colonizer.
President Moon said the issue of forced labor by Japanese firms is the judiciary's ruling. And just like Japan, Korea respects the separation of powers between three branches of government. He said while the basic agreement between two countries is still valid, the individual worker's right to claim compensation to Japanese firm has not been done away with.
And on the shutdown of a Japan-funded foundation to compensate Korean women forced by Japan into sexual slavery, President Moon said he hopes to consult with Tokyo to come up with ways to use the money it's already spent. In 2016, Japan provided 1 billion yen, or about $8.8 million to run the foundation meant to help the victims. But when it comes to joining forces to handle geopolitical issues in the region, namely the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, the two sides agreed. Communication needs to be stepped up not only between Korea and Japan, but also between the neighbors and the United States. And President Moon asked for Japan's active support to achieve peace on the Korean peninsula. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
South Korea's Minister of Health and Welfare has announced plans to reform the national pension system. There are 4 proposals. The first is to keep things effectively as they are. The second plan would increase the basic monthly payout to $350, which would be an estimated income replacement rate of 40%. Another proposal is to raise the premium from the current rate of 9% to 12% in order to increase income replacement to 45%. And yet another one is to raise the premium rate to 13% and income replacement to 50%. The government has stressed, though, that any decision on reforming the pension system should be made through social consensus through the National Assembly and the Economic, Social and Labor Committee. South and North Korea have agreed to field joint teams in several events at the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. The agreement was reached by officials today at the Inter-Korean Liaison Office just north of the border. The joint teams will be in events where the two Koreas have competed together before, and South and North will march in together at the opening ceremony. Seoul and Pyongyang have also agreed to go ahead with a bid to co-host the Summer Olympics in 2032, starting with a letter of intent to the International Olympic Committee. The two Koreas will continue to sort out the details through additional meetings and the exchange of documents. A team of South Korean officials returned home on Thursday from a 3-day trip to North Korea focused on pushing ahead with a joint project in forestry. Seoul's Unification Ministry says the two sides held working-level talks on ways to modernize tree nurseries and to control pests. During the trip, they also inspected tree nurseries in the North's Hwanghae-bukdo province and in Pyongyang, as well as factories that make forestry-related equipment. Based on the inspection, they'll work on a detailed plan for their forestry cooperation after seeking advice from organizations and experts in the field. And yet more cooperation between the two Koreas. They've agreed on a date to hold a groundbreaking ceremony for their project to connect their railways and roads. As it turns out, it will happen before the end of the year, as agreed at the September summit in Pyongyang. Park Hee-jun reports.
South and North Korea have agreed to hold a groundbreaking ceremony for their joint project to modernize and connect their railways and roads on December 26th. and it will take place at the North Panmun station within the border village of Kaesong. This comes after the two sides held working-level talks on Thursday at the Joint Liaison Office in Kaesong, and according to Seoul's Unification Ministry, it's been decided that around 100 people from each side will attend the ceremony.
South and North Korea held talks today about the ceremony to start work on connecting railways and roads along the Gyeonggi Line and the Donghae Line. We agreed to hold the ceremony on Wednesday, December 26 at Panmun Station.
The ceremony will mark the official start of the two Koreas' joint transportation projects. The leaders of the two Koreas agreed at their Pyongyang summit in September to break ground on interconnected railways and roads within the year. To make it happen, the two sides have been inspecting the North's railways since earlier this month. They also completed a joint survey of roads along the western side of the peninsula, but have yet to fix a schedule for inspecting the ones in the east. The ministry says the ceremony will show the two Koreas' strong determination to push ahead with the project, but there's still the question of whether the ceremony would violate U.S.-led sanctions. If it would violate them, then Seoul will have to seek a sanctions waiver from Washington. The South Korean government will continue to work with the U.S. to go ahead with the event in a way that does not raise concerns from the international community. Park Ki-jun, Arirang News.
In other news, the immigration authorities on Korea's Jeju Island have given refugee status to two people from Yemen who fled the civil war in their country. The two are journalists who've written articles critical of the Houthi rebels. The authorities on Jeju judged that there is a high possibility they could be kidnapped, murdered, or otherwise harmed by the rebels if they went back to Yemen. For 50 other Yemenis, the agency gave them stay permits on humanitarian grounds, and it rejected the applications of 22 of them. This year, South Korea raised its minimum wage by more than 16%, a huge jump from previous years. What kind of effect it's having on the economy has been hotly debated, and the verdict isn't out yet. But the Bank of Korea says previous wage hikes have raised productivity in manufacturing. Go Jun-hee explains.
According to the Bank of Korea's report released on Friday, the impact of the rise in the minimum wage varies by sector and the number of workers a business employs. The analysis written by BOK researcher Yuk Seung-wan is based on data from Statistics Korea, including a survey on the economically active population and an employment survey covering different regions taken between 2011 and 2016. The study calculates the influence rate of the minimum wage, which measures the ratio of workers affected by the minimum wage hike to the total number of workers in an industry. And the rate varied depending on sector and the sizes of companies. For instance, the rate was high in industries related to food and clothing, meaning there's a high share of people affected by the minimum wage rise in those sectors. In contrast, the rate was low in people for working at oil refineries. The rate was also higher at small firms compared to their larger counterparts. It also found out how the rise in the minimum wage affected the qualitative aspects of the economy, such as workers' productivity. The manufacturing industry saw its productivity improve over the cited period, as higher salaries encourage employees to work harder. By sector, workers in the auto and textile goods sectors experienced a more positive effect in productivity compared to the electronics sector. By size, bigger firms experienced clear improvements in productivity compared to smaller firms. The report added such positive effects have the possibility to offset the negative effects coming from the sharp increase in labor costs. Ko Jun-hee, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
Ahead of the new year, President Moon has reshuffled a large number of senior government posts, appointing 16 new vice ministers, 2 of whom are vice ministers of finance. Among the new appointees, 3 are current presidential aides. The presidential secretary for jobs, Lee Ho-seung, has been appointed the first vice minister of finance. The presidential secretary for economic policy, Cha Young-wan, has become the second vice minister at the Office of Government Policy Coordination, and the presidential secretary for science and technology, Moon Mi-ok, is now the first vice minister of culture. According to the Blue House, the main objective of replacing these officials was to create a more dynamic cabinet and to revitalize the nation's sluggish economy. It can also be seen as the South Korean president's determination to take a firmer hold on state affairs as he starts his third year. Now, for a further look at this team, we have with us Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. It's good to have you here with us today.
Happy to be here.
So President Moon has announced a reshuffle of his vice ministers today, including two new vice finance ministers. I mean, what do you see in these changes today?
Okay, well, the replacement of 16 vice ministers is a very large switch in the top rank government officials. But for the economic vice ministers in particular, I think it's very interesting that he chose one from his job creation team in the Blue House and the other one whose background is in budget. Now, I think that pretty much points out what he wants to do for the next year or so. Job creation, and well, if your background is in budget, you're pretty much a generalist and a practical person, a pragmatist. So I think that shows basically how his policy approach is going to be for the next year or so.
Of course, and it wasn't just the vice ministers that were newly appointed. We saw the inauguration of a new chief financial minister as well, Hong Nam-gi. I mean, what do we know about him and what do you make of this appointment? And what does it say about his policies in the future as well? Okay, well,
Hong Nam-gi, I think, is known as pretty much a generalist. He has some experience in regulatory reform. He was in charge of it a few years ago. So I think President Moon, after he ignored the sort of supply side, productivity raising policies, I think he's going to put more emphasis on it in his third year. This has been one of his biggest weaknesses for his economic policies. On the other hand, he's also saying that he's not going to back away from the welfare policies either. He's no longer calling it income-led growth policies, but I think he's calling it now inclusive economic policy. That's fine. Seeing that we're probably headed to an economic slowdown, we probably need some more welfare policies and fiscal policies in place. But I think the answer for the long term is to improve productivity, and the new vice prime minister may be a good person for the job. We've tried fiscal policies before, we tried monetary policies before. They had some effect alleviating problems in the economy, but they haven't been able to carry out fundamental changes in the economy. That's part of the reason why Korean economy has been slowing down in the last 5, 6, 7 years. So hopefully they can get some more fundamental reforms, supply side reforms that'll improve the productivity and growth of the Korean economy.
I mean, you've mentioned a few things there, but I mean, if you can just break it down for us a little bit more. I mean, what are the biggest challenges of the Koreans' economic concerns right now?
Okay, well, in terms of macroeconomics, Korea is not in a good place right now. Exports, well, it has been going up. It has been setting record size. But the problem is, once you take away semiconductors, it's not doing very well. If you compare the numbers from January to October, November's number isn't completely available yet. And if you compare it to January, October of last year, well, if you look at the entire exports, it went up by 6.4%. But once you take away semiconductors, it only went up by 0.46%. If you just take the numbers from January to September, it actually fell from last January to September. So we're, in terms of exports, we're really very much dependent on very few industries which are doing well, semiconductors and oil refinery. So exports is not in a good place. Investment, it has fallen in the last 5 months before October. Went up a bit in October, but KDI believes that that's more due to seasonal factors than any fundamental underlying factors. So investment is underperforming. Consumption, it has been enjoying a moderate growth, but it has been slowing down in the last couple of months. And the leading indicators, the consumer sentiment, has been going down. So that's not in a good place either. And job creation, employment, well, that has been disappointing almost the entire year. Especially if you look at consumption and investment, they reflect part of what consumers and investments feel about the future, and the fact that those numbers aren't doing well seems to indicate that people are generally pessimistic about the near future rather than optimistic.
So things haven't been going well for the last year, that's what you've just said. But President Moon came into the office about a year and a half ago, and he introduced his policies, which were quite drastic as well, which he labelled originally income-led growth, as you said, but which he's changed name as well. And it was also dubbed, J-nomics by some. I mean, what do you make of his policy so far, considering the fact that results haven't seemed to be very good this year?
Okay, well, I think part of the problem is that partially because this is a new liberal president coming after a period of conservative rule, partially because presidents only have 5 terms. I think he attempted too much too quickly, and a lot of what he attempted in the name of income-led growth policies actually worked against job creation. For example, the minimum wage, it seems to have cut down jobs in a lot of retail, service, the lodging sectors, and then creation of a large number of public jobs. While they may have helped some young people get secure jobs in the government sector, I think it sort of over-encouraged the young people to try to seek those jobs. So now it's harder than ever to get for small and medium-sized enterprises to find good young workers. And I think part of the reason why we have such a high unemployment rate for the young is because, well, they want to go after the government jobs, the good jobs that perhaps President Moon has convinced these young people that there's going to be a lot available, a lot more than it actually is. So I think some aspect of the policy has sort of worked against each other, partially because President Moon had a very wide and very adventurous agenda, which didn't quite work out, and partially because a lot of his policy goals perhaps were working at odds with each other.
But I guess it wasn't, perhaps not all bad news. I mean, employment figures came out yesterday for November, and that showed that the number of newly employed people was above the 100,000 mark for the first time in 5 months. I mean, how does that number factor into the current situation? Okay,
if you look at the numbers behind the numbers, that's not very optimistic either. The growth took place mostly for jobs for people who are over 60 years old. If you look at the people who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, their numbers actually fell. People in their 20s, it went down by, I believe, 0.1%. People in their 50s went down by 0.5% in terms of the employment rate. People in their 20s, it went up slightly, but still the youth unemployment is considered very, very high. Now, the reason that this is a bit worrying is because, well, people in their 20s and 30s, people in their 30s and 40s and 50s are head of households. So they're responsible for making major purchases, consumer durables, so that doesn't speak well for a future of consumption. Also, because they're head of the household, they have to consider 10, 20, 30 years in the future, as well as what's going to happen with their families right now. And the fact that their employment numbers are going down is worrying in many fronts. And then where the job increases took place. The largest number of job increases took place in social welfare and health work and agriculture. Now, both of those areas, well, health and social work, that's a place where government has been really pushing the increasing number of jobs. Agriculture is probably where you go when you don't really have any place else to go to. So the fact that the largest number of job growth took place in those two sectors are a bit worrying because perhaps we're too over-reliant on government jobs. In fact, where the numbers fell in terms of employment, one of the largest fall came from manufacturing, and those are usually what we consider good jobs. So the fact that the numbers are falling there should be a bit worrying. Part of that comes from economic restructuring, which is definitely necessary, but still, the fact that we're running low on sectors where we have good private jobs and running up in the sectors where jobs come from government support, I think in the long term is a bit worrying.
One of the biggest factors that has changes in the Korean economy in the last couple of months as well is that the Bank of Korea raised its interest rates for the first time in about a year by about 0.25%. Now, it's perhaps delayed. I mean, it should have been a long time coming, especially compared to the US. But what does this mean for Korea looking ahead as well now?
Okay, well, if you look at how it affected the market, it didn't affect the market very much at all. And partially that's because the Bank of Korea has been signaling the interest rate increase the whole year. And I think partially because, well, when the interest rate fell during the slowdown we had 3 or 4 years ago, that didn't affect the market very much either. So I think it's a bit natural that once the rate goes up, it doesn't have as much effect as if you feared. On the other hand, the reason that we're raising the interest rate is because, well, U.S. right now has higher interest rate than Korea, and the differential after the BOK increase is right now 0.25 to 0.5%. U.S. is expected to raise their rates by 0.25% in next week, and then it'll rise back up to the difference of 0.75% again. The last time Korea had a lower rate than the United States, it never went beyond 1%. So this time the BOK, as well as the financial markets, I think worried that if it goes beyond 1%, then we're heading into unknown territory. So we want to keep that interest rate differential below 1%. And one of the ways of doing that is to raise it now and keep the rate differential at 0.75%. So when U.S. raises the rates again next year, Korea doesn't necessarily have to raise its rates exactly the same time as the U.S. But having said that, I think because the U.S. economy seems to be slowing down, originally earlier this year we expected the Fed to raise the rates perhaps 3 to 5 times next year. But now a lot of people are saying that perhaps they'll only raise it once next year or maybe twice. If the Fed only raises the rates once or twice next year, then I don't think BOK has to raise its rates at all. So I think what we've done is we've given ourselves a little time so that we don't necessarily have to follow the U.S. every time they raise their interest rates.
Interesting. Well, let's look ahead now. I mean, President Moon has a lot on his plate, I think, coming into the third year with many economic challenges ahead. His administration has stressed the need to front-load next year's budget to try and tackle those challenges head-on and early so it can help the economy next year. I mean, will that work? And what else do they really need to be doing? Okay, well, I think it always helps a little bit when you add in fiscal policy when the economy is seems to be slowing down. Having said that, though, we front-loaded almost every year's budget for the last 4 or 5 years. So I don't think this is unusual. And usually what happens in the second half of the year is that the slowdown isn't conquered. The slowdown continues. So we usually end up passing a supplementary budget. If things go as everybody fears right now, if the global economy slowdown does take place next year, then I think we'll see the same pattern. So we'll probably see a lot of front-loaded budget next year, but slowdown will continue longer than 6 months. So we'll probably pass some supplementary budget. I don't think that in itself is bad. If the situation is bad, then you have to deal with it flexibly. And if that means passing a supplementary budget, then be it. But I think we really do need to look at what goes into those supplementary budget, where the program goes, because last 2 years we've had super budgets, budgets which have grown considerably from the previous year's budget, and that doesn't really help the economy that much. We've put in a lot of money in job creation this year and last year, but it didn't really help very much. So I think we really need to review these programs to see whether the money is being spent effectively and review the programs so that we put a lot of money in the effective programs rather than the ineffective ones. And finally, before we go, one thing we haven't really talked about is other uncertainties and the external factors, such as the global economy, like with the China and US trade war, Brexit happening possibly, and the European Central Bank also coming out of QE. I mean, how are these going to affect the South Korean economy as well, and how can they guard against these changes?
Okay, well, biggest problem in the global economy, I think, is the U.S. and China, but not necessarily the trade war. Because, well, China does export a lot of stuff to the United States, but it's only 4% of their GDP. It's about 18% of their total exports. United States does import a lot from China, but again, the percentages, I believe, something like 2.6%. So in terms of real economy, the trade war shouldn't affect the economies that much. But the problem is both U.S. and China seems to be slowing down. China's economy has been slowing down for the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of it because their financial situation is problematic. Their state-owned enterprises have a lot of debt. United States, their corporate debt is becoming worrisome, and a lot of people are expecting the U.S. to go into a slowdown next year and perhaps even a recession in 2020. And then trade war, what it does, it may not affect the real economy very much, but it will raise prices of consumer goods and parts in the United States. That means the Fed may be forced to raise the interest rate to head off inflation. And that, I think, at least in the short term, is the biggest problem. If the Fed raises the interest rates faster than we expect, and right now, at least the possibility of that has fallen because U.S. seems to be heading toward a slowdown. But if the trade war does increase the chances of U.S. raising its interest rates, then that will make the international finance market, especially emerging markets, more unstable, and that means problems not only for the world but also Korean financial markets. So I think that's the thing that we have to be really aware of, not just the trade war, but the slowdown in U.S. and China in general.
That's all we have time for. But anyway, thank you for coming on the show today, and it's always great to get your insights.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our show. We'll be back next week with more analysis of the day's top stories. In the meantime, thank you for watching and hope you have a great weekend. Goodbye.